There is a sentence my dying son said to me in a hospital room, and I have not slept a full night since. He was 11 years old. His skin had gone gray, and his lips were cracked, and his small hand was shaking in mine, and he looked up at me with eyes that were too tired for a boy his age. He asked me 8 words. "Dad, if I die now, will the pain stop?" I told him no. I told him he was going to be fine, that the doctors would fix it, that he just had to hold on a little longer. I lied to my own child. I lied because I could not bear the truth, and because I did not yet know that the truth was far worse than anything I could have imagined. And then, one night he closed his eyes, the way I had been dreading since the day they admitted him. My name does not matter anymore. What matters is what I learned, and what it cost me to learn it. I was an ordinary man with an ordinary life. I had a wife I had loved since we were both young and foolish, and a son who had my stubborn chin and his mother's gentle heart. We were not rich, but we were comfortable. We had a home we had built with our own savings, brick by brick, over years of going without, and we had family. That, I used to believe, was the thing that made us safe. Family was the wall around us. Family was the people you never had to fear. I know now how wrong I was, and I would give anything to unknow it. The sickness came for my son first. It started small, the way these things do. A stomachache he could not explain. A tiredness that no amount of sleep could fix. We took him to the doctor, and the doctor frowned and ran tests and frowned again. Nothing made sense. A healthy boy does not simply begin to wither. They admitted him. They gave him fluids and medicines and words of comfort, and still he grew weaker, and still no one could name what was wrong. I sat by that bed for 19 days. I watched my son disappear an inch at a time, and I prayed to a God I was not sure was listening, and I had no idea that the answer to every question was already living under my own roof. When he asked me that question, when he asked if dying would make the pain stop, something in me broke and never fully healed. I have replayed that moment 10,000 times. I have asked myself what I should have said, whether there were words that could have held him here. But there were no words. By then it was already too late, though I did not understand why. The next morning his small body simply gave out. The doctors used careful language. They said his organs had failed. They said sometimes there are illnesses medicine cannot explain. They handed me papers to sign, and they were kind. And I walked out of that hospital, a hollowed-out version of the man who had walked in. My wife held the family together through the funeral. I do not know how. She was the strong one. She always had been, the one who remembered everyone's birthdays and cooked when someone was grieving and knew exactly what to say. While I drowned, she swam for both of us. And then, 3 weeks after we buried our son, she began to feel tired. A stomachache she could not explain. A weakness in her legs. I remember the exact moment she mentioned it. Standing at our kitchen counter, and I remember the cold that went through me, because I had heard those words before. I had heard them from my son. I told myself it was grief. Grief makes the body sick. Everyone knows that. I told myself she was just exhausted, that she had carried too much, that rest would mend her. But the rest did not mend her. She got worse, exactly as he had in the same order, with the same gray creeping into her skin. We went back to the same hospital, to the same kind of doctors, who ran the same tests and wore the same helpless frowns. And I sat by another bed, holding another hand, watching the second half of my heart slip away from me, while the world offered no explanation at all. She knew before I did. I think the dying often do. In her last clear hour, she pulled me close, and her voice was barely a thread, and she said only this: "Take care of our boy. Promise me." She had forgotten in that moment that our boy was already gone. Or perhaps she had not forgotten at all. Perhaps she meant something I was too broken to understand. I promised her. I held her hand, and I promised her, and a few hours later she was gone too, and I was alone in a way that has no word in any language I know. I want you to understand what kind of man I was in the weeks after. I was not a man who suspected anyone. I was not looking for a villain. I believed I had been visited by the worst kind of bad luck, the kind that empties a house and leaves one survivor to wander the rooms. I had no anger, because anger needs a direction, and I had none. I had only the silence of a home built for 3, and now holding 1. If you had told me then that my family had been murdered, I would not have believed you. I would have thought you cruel. It was my cousin who had always been there. I should tell you about him now because everything turns on him. He was older than me by a few years, smooth in the way that some men are smooth, the kind who always knew the right thing to say and the right hand to shake. Growing up, he had been the clever one, the one who went into business, who understood money in a way the rest of us did not. When my parents were alive, he had advised them. When my uncles needed help with their affairs, he was the one they called. He was the family's quiet authority on anything to do with contracts, with savings, and especially with insurance. That was his particular gift. Years ago, he had brought the whole family into the same insurance arrangement. He explained it to us patiently, the way you explain something to children. He said that if we wanted our wealth protected, if we wanted to be certain that no stranger and no bank could ever take what we had worked for, we should each name him as our next of kin on our policies. He understood the paperwork, he said. He would handle everything. He would make sure that when the worst happened, the money went where it should, and not into the pockets of lawyers and government men. We trusted him. Every one of us signed. It seemed like wisdom. It seemed like love. I was the only one who did things differently. Not out of suspicion. I want to be honest about that. I had no suspicion. It was simply that when I took out my own policy, it felt wrong to name anyone but my wife and my son. They were my reason for everything. So I named them, the two of them, against my cousin's gentle advice that I really ought to let him manage it like everyone else. He smiled when I told him. He said I was sentimental. He said it was fine. I thought nothing of it. I think about it constantly now. The day everything changed, I came home earlier than I usually did. The house had become a place I could hardly stand to enter, and so I had taken to staying out, walking, sitting in places where there were other people, anything to delay the moment of the key in the lock. But that day I came home in the afternoon, and as I stepped through the door I stopped, because something was not right. My cousin was inside my house. He had a key. He had always had a key. That was the kind of trust we had. But he was not sitting waiting for me. He was bent over the drawer in my front room, the drawer where I kept my documents, and his hands were moving through my papers with a speed and purpose that did not look like a man waiting for tea. He did not hear me at first. I stood in the doorway with tears still wet on my face, because I cried often in those days and felt no shame in it, and I watched him search. And as I watched, he straightened, and he went to the wall, to the corner where my CCTV camera sat, the small one I had installed years ago and half forgotten about. And he reached up, and he took hold of the cable that fed it, and he began, carefully, to work it loose, to cut me off from my own eyes inside my own home. It is strange how the body knows before the mind does. I had no theory, no accusations, nothing my thinking self could have put into words. But something cold and certain moved through me as I watched his fingers on that cable. And for the first time since the funerals, I felt something other than grief. I felt suspicion. He turned then and he saw me. And the look on his face is a thing I will carry to my grave. It was not the face of a man caught doing something innocent. It was the face of a man caught. He fumbled. He tried to step in front of the camera, to hide what his hands had been doing, and the clumsiness of it, the guilt of it, made the cold thing in my chest grow teeth. He said something about checking on me. He said he had been worried, that he had come to make sure I was eating, that he had only been tidying. His words came too fast, and there were too many of them. I said almost nothing. I have learned that silence frightens a guilty man more than any question. He stayed a few more minutes, talking, filling the air, watching my face for what I knew, and then he left, and I stood alone in the doorway for a long time, and then I went to the camera he had not quite finished disconnecting, and I sat down, and I began to watch. I did not know what I was looking for. I only knew that the recordings went back months, that the system kept everything, and that my cousin had been very interested in making sure it kept nothing more. So I went backward. I went to the days before my son first fell ill, and I watched my own kitchen play out in silent gray footage, ordinary evenings, my wife cooking, my boy at the table with his school books. And then I saw him, my cousin, in my kitchen on an evening I half remembered, standing over my son's plate while the boy was out of the room, and I watched his hand move over the food. A small motion, a practiced motion. Something falling from his fingers that should not have been there. I do not have the words for what happened inside me then. I watched it again. I watched it a third time, a fourth, leaning so close to the screen that my breath fogged it. There was no mistaking it. There was no innocent way to read what those hands were doing. And then, because I had to know, because the not knowing would have killed me, I went forward to the weeks after my son died, to the evenings before my wife began to feel tired, and I found it again. The same man, the same kitchen, his hand passing over her cup, her drink, the tea she took every night before bed, the same small falling motion, the same care. I sat in that chair until the room went dark around me, and I did not turn on a light. Everything I had believed about my own life was rearranging itself in the blackness. The bad luck that had emptied my house had a name. It had a face I had known since childhood, a face I had wept in front of, a face I had thanked for its kindness during the funerals of the two people it had killed. My son's pain, the pain he had begged me to take away, the pain I had told him was just an illness, had been put into his body deliberately, spoonful by spoonful, by a man who called me brother. Before we go any further, please encourage this channel by subscribing. It costs you nothing, and it means everything to us. And once I could think again, the larger shape of it began to rise out of the dark, and it was worse than one cousin and then one's poison. I began to count. I am from a large family, and we are not as large as we were. Over the years there had been deaths. An aunt, some time ago, who simply weakened and faded, and we said it was her age. An uncle whose heart, the doctors said, had given out in his sleep. Others, each one a sorrow, each one accepted, each one natural. And after each one, I now understood. The same man had handled the paperwork. The same man had been the next of kin. The same man had collected what was owed and grown a little richer, and a little smoother, and a little more trusted than before. He had built it all so carefully. The insurance was never protection. It was the machine. He had spent years making himself the name on every policy, the heir to every death, and then, patiently, with no hurry at all, he had begun to harvest. A family does not suspect its own kindest member. A family that loses people slowly, one at a time, across years, calls it fate. And all the while the money flowed in one direction, toward the clever cousin who understood contracts, who grew wealthier with every funeral he helped us through, who wept at the gravesides he had dug. And then I understood the last thing, the thing about my wife and my son, and it is the part I can hardly say even now. He killed them not because they were named on his policies, because they were not. He killed them because they were named on mine. I had broken his pattern. I had refused, gently and without suspicion, to make him my heir, and I had given that place instead to the two people I loved most, and so he took them. Not for their money, for there was no money in it for him. He took them to punish me for stepping aside his machine. He took them to break me, to hollow me out, to leave me with nothing, so that I would come crawling back to the clever cousin to manage what was left. And when I was dependent on him again, when I was the last one standing and leaning on him, I would have been next. I see that now. I was always meant to be next. I went to the police. I will not pretend it was simple, or that the law moved the way it does in stories. But I had the footage, and the footage does not lie, and in the end they brought him in. I was there, in a manner of speaking, for what came after. I will not describe all of it. Men were rough with him, rougher than the law allows, and I did not stop them, and I will let God judge me for that. What I will tell you is that he confessed. He confessed to my son. He confessed to my wife. And then, in the flat voice of a man who has finally stopped pretending, he confessed to the others, the ones we had buried across the years and called natural. He told us how, and he told us when, and he told us that the insurance had been his idea from the very beginning, the next of kin arrangement, his careful design, all of it built so that no one would ever take the property, by which he meant, so that no one but him would ever take a thing. He is in a cell now. The law has him. I should feel that something has been balanced, and on some days I almost do. But the truth is that the law caught the end of the story, not the whole of it. There were more deaths in my family than I will ever be able to prove. There are graves I visited as a mourner that I now visit as something else. And I will never know, not truly, how many of them were his work, and how many were the ordinary sorrows of a large family. I count them at night. I never reach a number I trust. I told you at the beginning about my son's last words, and I have told you about my wife's, the promise I made and could not keep. There is a third voice I have to give you, because it is the one that haunts me most, and it came to me only after everything else was understood. My grandmother died years before any of this began. She was very old and she went quietly, and we grieved her the way you grieve someone who has lived a long, full life. I sat with her near the end, and in her last hours, when her mind seemed to be wandering, she gripped my hand with a strength that surprised me, and she said something I dismissed as the confusion of the dying. She said, "Do not trust the one who counts the money." I thought she was rambling. I patted her hand and I told her to rest. She was not rambling. She knew. Somehow, at the very end, she knew. and she tried to warn a grandson who was too young and too trusting to hear her. She was the first. She was trying to save the rest of us, and we buried her warning with her. So that is the whole of it. The man who counted our money is behind bars, and my house is quiet, and I keep a promise I cannot keep to a wife who is gone, watching over a boy who is gone, in a home built for three. I do not have a lesson to leave you with, not really. I only have my grandmother's words, the ones I did not understand in time. Do not trust the one who counts the money. Look at your own families, at the kind and clever ones who handle the paperwork, who arrange the policies, who always know best. I am not telling you to fear them. I am telling you what it cost me to learn that family is not always the wall around you. Sometimes family is the thing that is already inside.